The bride was beautiful, the venue was perfect, and someone in the wedding party was about to ruin everything. Jake Sullivan had photographed over 200 weddings since leaving the military, but this was the first time he'd spotted a professional killer among the guests. Welcome to Real Heroes Stories. Before we continue, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button to keep these voices alive. The first red flag hit Jake Sullivan at exactly 2:30 p.m. on what should have been the perfect October Saturday. A man in a charcoal gray suit was photographing the wedding venue with his phone. But not like a normal guest. The stranger moved with military precision, documenting exit points, security camera angles, and staff positions. Jake recognized the pattern immediately because he'd done it himself during Army reconnaissance missions in Afghanistan. But here's what made Jake's blood run cold. The man wasn't just taking pictures. He was timing security patrols, counting staff members, and mapping escape routes. This wasn't wedding photography. This was target reconnaissance. The Riverside Country Club buzzed with pre-ceremony activity. Golden sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows where Jake adjusted his camera for what should have been routine getting-ready shots. 23-year-old bride Emma Richardson sat radiant in her flowing white gown, her mother fussing with the veil while bridesmaids touched up makeup in the background. Staff Sergeant Jake Sullivan had spent 8 years with the 75th Ranger Regiment before a roadside bomb ended his military career and left him with a permanent limp. The transition to civilian life had been brutal. PTSD counseling, physical therapy, months of wondering what came next. His therapist had suggested photography to channel his need for precision into something peaceful. Focus on capturing joy instead of threats, Dr. Martinez had said. For 3 years, that advice worked perfectly. Wedding photography paid well, kept him around happy people, and let him use military discipline in a different context. Sullivan Moments photography had built a solid reputation among affluent communities. He specialized in candid shots that captured genuine emotion, tears during vows, laughter during toasts, quiet moments between chaos. But right now, Jake's military instincts were screaming that today would be different. "Jake, honey, can you get some shots of Emma with her grandmother?" called Margaret Richardson. She flew in from Florida specifically for this. "Absolutely, Mrs. Richardson," Jake replied, his voice calm while his mind raced through threat assessment protocols. Through his telephoto lens, he tracked gray suit man emerging from behind catering trucks. The stranger wasn't just reconnoitering anymore, he was planting something. A small black device, barely visible, had been attached under the head table where the bride and groom would sit during dinner. Jake's blood froze. Remote detonator. He was certain. He captured Emma embracing her grandmother while calculating blast radius. The device's position would maximize casualties among the wedding party while giving the bomber clean escape through the kitchen. Professional placement. Military precision. What if this was your family? What if you were just trying to celebrate the happiest day of your life, completely unaware that someone wanted to turn it into a nightmare? "Sweetie, you look absolutely radiant," the grandmother whispered, tears in her eyes. "Your grandfather would have been so proud." Jake clicked the shutter at the perfect moment, capturing raw emotion while his mind screamed warnings. This family had no idea they were 90 minutes away from a bombing, and Jake was the only one who could stop it. But here's what Jake didn't know yet, what none of them knew as the clock ticked toward 4 p.m. ceremony start. The device under the head table wasn't a bomb. It was a listening device. and someone was using it to monitor conversations about a very specific guest who hadn't arrived yet. The real target was still coming. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Beautiful venue. Perfect for a celebration or a funeral. His military training kicked into overdrive. This wasn't paranoia or PTSD flashbacks. Someone was actively threatening this wedding. Someone who knew he was watching. Someone who wanted him to know. "Jake, we need to head down to get Michael and the groomsmen ready," Mrs. Richardson announced. "The ceremony starts in 90 minutes. Jake nodded, gathering equipment while his phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. "The package arrives at 5:15 p.m. Be ready." 90 minutes until ceremony. 45 minutes until whatever package was arriving. Jake's military training had taught him that in tactical situations, timing was everything. Someone was orchestrating events down to the minute. The groomsmen's suite occupied the club's lower level, overlooking the golf course where the outdoor ceremony would take place. Jake found groom Michael Patterson adjusting his bow tie with nervous energy, surrounded by 6 friends in matching charcoal tuxedos. The atmosphere was light, filled with good-natured ribbing that accompanied bachelor send-offs. "Sully," called out best man Danny Torres, using the nickname Jake had earned among regular clients. "Ready to make our boy look good for posterity?" "That's what they pay me for," Jake replied, raising his camera while scanning the room's occupants. His photographer persona was naturally observational. Nobody questioned why he studied people so intently. Michael Patterson, 25, worked as an investment analyst at a prominent New York firm. Clean-cut, athletic build, coming from old money. Normal groom nerves seemed genuine as he fumbled with cufflinks and asked repeatedly if his hair looked right. But as Jake photographed pre-ceremony preparations, pieces of a puzzle began forming. Why would someone target a small-town wedding? Unless the target wasn't random. "Hey, Sully, grab a shot of this," laughed groomsman Alex Chen, holding up his phone. "Mike's been getting weird calls all week from some private investigator. Apparently someone's been asking questions about his family's business dealings." Jake's blood went cold. "What kind of questions?" "Something about offshore accounts and tax evasion," Michael said nervously. "My dad thinks it's competitors trying to dig up dirt before his confirmation hearing." "Confirmation hearing?" Jake asked casually, while his mind raced. "Federal judge appointment," Danny explained. "Mike's dad is up for Second Circuit Court of Appeals. Big deal if it goes through." Suddenly everything clicked into place. This wasn't about Michael. It was about his father, judge nominee Robert Patterson. Someone wanted to send a message about what happened to families of judges who made inconvenient rulings. Now Jake understood the timeline. The package arriving at 5:15 p.m. The listening device under the head table. The professional surveillance. This was political intimidation escalating to violence. At 3:30 p.m., Jake's phone buzzed again. "Package delayed. 5:45 p.m. arrival. Adjust timeline accordingly." Jake felt sick. Whoever was running this operation was monitoring communications and adapting in real time. Professional-level coordination. Military precision. He stepped outside the groomsmen's suite and called the number back. Straight to voicemail with no greeting. Dead end. But as he walked toward the ceremony area, Jake spotted something that confirmed his worst fears. Gray Suit Man was talking to a catering staff member, a young woman with a ponytail who kept glancing nervously toward the kitchen. The conversation lasted exactly 90 seconds. Then the woman handed over what looked like a keycard and hurried away. Jake raised his camera and photographed the exchange through his telephoto lens. The woman's name tag read, Melissa, kitchen staff. But her body language screamed coercion, not cooperation. Someone had gotten to the catering company's employees. The ceremony space was a masterpiece of autumn elegance, white chairs arranged in perfect rows facing a flower-adorned arch overlooking the river. Event staff moved with practiced efficiency, making final adjustments to table settings and sound equipment. Everything looked absolutely normal. Except Jake now knew that at least one staff member was compromised. Someone had planted surveillance equipment under the head table, and an unknown package was arriving in 75 minutes. He photographed venue setup while conducting reconnaissance. Exits: main entrance through clubhouse, service road to kitchen, emergency exit through pro shop, and open access to golf course and parking. In a hostile situation, too many ways meant too many ways for threats to approach undetected. The guest list was posted at reception check-in. 180 people, mostly family and college friends. Jake studied names quickly, looking for anything that stood out. Then he saw it. Robert Patterson Sr., plus guest. Michael's father, the federal judge nominee. Jake's military experience had taught him that high-value targets often traveled with security details. If Judge Patterson was attending his son's wedding, there should be federal marshals or FBI protection in the vicinity. But Jake hadn't spotted any obvious protective details, which meant either the judge's security was extremely discreet or he'd declined protection for his son's wedding. Both scenarios created vulnerabilities that professionals could exploit. But here's what terrified Jake most. What made his hands shake as he adjusted his camera settings. The listening device wasn't just for surveillance, it was for targeting confirmation. Someone needed to verify exactly where Judge Patterson would be sitting before deploying whatever was in that incoming package. Put yourself in Jake's position for a moment. You're just trying to do your job, capture beautiful memories for a young couple, when you realize you're the only person who can prevent a terrorist attack. What would you do? At 3:45 p.m., bridesmaids began their walk down the aisle as Jake captured the moment. Emma appeared radiant as her father escorted her toward Michael, who waited at the altar with genuine emotion on his face. The afternoon sun cast perfect golden light across the scene. But as Jake focused his telephoto lens on the couple's first look, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Graysuit Man had positioned himself with unobstructed sightlines to the altar, but he wasn't alone anymore. Jake counted at least 3 other men in different sections of the crowd, all maintaining similar positioning and awareness patterns. This wasn't a lone operative. This was a coordinated team. The ceremony proceeded beautifully as Jake documented every moment while keeping peripheral awareness of potential threats. Emma and Michael exchanged vows with genuine emotion, bringing tears to family members in the front rows. When they kissed as husband and wife, the crowd erupted in applause and joy. Jake captured it all: the bride's tears, the groom's relief, the family's happiness. But his trained mind was cataloging exit routes and threat positions. As guests moved from ceremony to cocktail hour, Jake noticed all 4 suspicious individuals had disappeared. At 4:47 p.m., his phone buzzed with a final message. Phase 1 complete. Beginning final approach. Jake checked his watch and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. In his military days, he'd had backup, weapons, and clear rules of engagement. Tonight, he had a camera and a growing certainty that someone was about to turn Emma and Michael's perfect day into a nightmare. The cocktail hour would start in 8 minutes. The package would arrive in 58 minutes. And somewhere in between, Jake Sullivan was going to have to decide how far he was willing to go to protect people who had no idea they were in danger. The question wasn't whether he could stop what was coming. The question was whether he could live with himself if he didn't try. The cocktail hour began at 4:55 p.m., with champagne toasts and nervous laughter, but Jake Sullivan wasn't celebrating. He had exactly 50 minutes before the mysterious package arrived, and he'd just confirmed this wasn't a random threat. Federal Judge Robert Patterson Sr. had arrived 15 minutes early in an unmarked black sedan. No visible security detail, no federal marshals, just a 62-year-old man attending his son's wedding, completely unaware that someone wanted to send him a very public message about the consequences of judicial independence. Jake positioned himself near the bar, camera raised to capture candid moments while conducting surveillance. The reception area buzzed with high society, investment bankers, corporate lawyers, old money families who'd known each other for generations. Perfect cover for professional operators who knew how to blend into affluent crowds. His phone vibrated. Target confirmed on site. Maintain visual surveillance until package delivery. Someone was watching him watch them. Jake felt the familiar sensation of being hunted, a feeling he hadn't experienced since Afghanistan. But this time, he wasn't just prey, he was the only one who could prevent a massacre. Think about every wedding you've ever attended. The joy, the celebration, the families coming together. Now imagine discovering that someone wants to turn that celebration into a message written in blood. "Sully, you getting some great shots?" called Danny Torres, approaching with a martini and loose tie. "Emma's been worried about lighting for reception photos." "Everything looks perfect," Jake replied, scanning the crowd over Danny's shoulder. Through his viewfinder, he spotted something that made his blood freeze. Melissa, the nervous catering staff member who'd handed over the key card earlier, was now serving drinks to Judge Patterson. But her hands were shaking, and she kept glancing toward the kitchen with obvious distress. "Danny, I need to ask you something," Jake said quietly. "Has Michael or his family received any specific threats recently?" "What kind of threats?" Danny's expression shifted from party mode to serious concern. "Legal threats, political pressure, anything related to his father's confirmation hearing." Danny's face went pale. "Jesus, Sully, how did you know about that?" "Mike's been keeping it quiet, but yeah, his dad's been getting anonymous letters for weeks. Something about dropping out of the confirmation process, or facing consequences for the family." Jake's military training kicked into overdrive. Anonymous threats, escalating to physical surveillance, then to direct action at a family event. Classic intimidation pattern used by organized crime, foreign intelligence services, or domestic extremist groups. But here's what Jake realized in that moment. What made his photographer's hands steady even as his soldier's heart raced. These weren't random terrorists. They were professionals executing precision operation designed to send a political message, which meant they had rules, protocols, weaknesses he could exploit. "Where's Michael now?" Jake asked. "Over by the head table, talking to his dad about honeymoon plans." Danny pointed toward the area where Jake had spotted the listening device earlier. "Why? What's going on?" But Jake was already moving, camera in hand, crossing the reception area with purpose. If someone was monitoring conversations at the head table, they'd heard everything about the judge's travel schedule, security arrangements, and family details. At 5:15 p.m., exactly on schedule, a white catering van pulled up to the service entrance. Jake's phone buzzed. Package delivered. Phase 2, initiating. The van's license plate was temporary dealer tags, untraceable. Two men in catering uniforms emerged and began unloading equipment that looked standard for wedding service. But Jake's military experience with logistics told him something was wrong. The cases were too heavy, too carefully handled, and secured with locks. He raised his camera and photographed the delivery through windows while pretending to capture reception ambiance. Through his telephoto lens, he could read stenciled lettering on one case. Audio/visual equipment. Handle with care. But the way the men carried it suggested contents much heavier than cameras or microphones. That's when Jake realized the listening device under the head table hadn't been for surveillance. It had been for targeting. Someone needed to confirm exactly where Judge Patterson would be sitting before deploying whatever was in those cases. "Sir, excuse me," a voice behind him said. Jake turned to find a young woman in catering uniform, not Melissa, but another staff member with the same nervous energy. "The head photographer needs to see you in the kitchen immediately." Jake had never spoken to any head photographer. This was a setup. "I think you have me confused with someone else," he replied calmly while noting her position relative to exits. "I'm the only photographer here today." "Please, sir, it's urgent." Her voice carried stress of someone following instructions under duress. "He said to tell you it's about the special equipment you ordered." Jake's hand moved instinctively toward the small tactical knife he carried in his camera bag. Old habits from military service. But drawing a weapon in a crowded wedding reception would create panic and give the opposition every excuse to accelerate their timeline. "Lead the way," he said, following her while texting a quick message. 911, armed threat at wedding reception, multiple suspects. Request immediate tactical response. The message failed to send. Cell towers were being jammed. The kitchen buzzed with controlled chaos as staff prepared dinner service for 180 guests. Industrial ovens, prep stations, and dishwashers created enough noise to mask conversations or muffle sounds of violence. Jake counted at least 6 catering workers, but only 3 looked like legitimate staff. The others moved with controlled awareness of operators pretending to be civilians. "Your photographer is here," the nervous woman announced to a man Jake recognized immediately. Gray suit man had changed into kitchen whites, but his tactical posture remained unchanged. Professional bearing, situational awareness, and the telltale bulge of concealed weapons under his chef's jacket. "Mr. Sullivan," Gray suit man said simply. No accent, no dramatics. He gestured for Jake to move deeper into the kitchen, where other staff members were positioned strategically near exits. "We need to talk." Jake's instincts screamed danger, but he needed information. "What do you want?" "Your cooperation." Gray suit man kept it brief. "You've been watching us." "We've been watching you." "I don't know what you're talking about." Gray suit man nodded to one of his men, who held up a tablet showing security footage of Jake photographing their van delivery. Time-stamped, clear angle, undeniable evidence. Jake's military training kicked in. These weren't amateurs playing dress-up. They had surveillance infrastructure, real-time coordination, and backup plans. Professional operation with military precision. But here's what Gray Suit Man didn't know. What Jake had learned in 8 years of combat operations. Professional doesn't mean perfect. Every operation has vulnerabilities. Every team has weaknesses. Jake just needed to find theirs. "What do you want?" Jake asked. "Simple. Continue photographing. Leave at 10 p.m. Gray Suit Man's tone carried no negotiation. "Judge withdraws his nomination tonight, or there are consequences." Jake saw his opening. Instead of waiting passively, he needed intelligence. "And if I say no?" Gray Suit Man gestured subtly. 2 of his men moved closer, casual but threatening. But he didn't elaborate on consequences, professional restraint that revealed crucial information. Jake took a calculated risk. "You need me to stay quiet, which means you need me alive. That gives me leverage." For the first time, Gray Suit Man's expression shifted slightly. He hadn't expected pushback from a wedding photographer. "The judge has until 7:30 p.m., Gray Suit Man said. "Dinner service timing is not negotiable." Jake was getting useful intel. Timeline confirmed. Deadline established. They needed Judge Patterson to make the call himself, which meant they couldn't simply kill him. The political message required voluntary withdrawal under pressure. But here's what Jake realized that Gray Suit Man hadn't considered. A former Army Ranger with 8 years of combat experience wasn't going to walk away from innocent civilians in danger, not for threats, not for leverage, not for anything. "I'll think about it," Jake said, turning toward the door. "Mr. Sullivan." Gray Suit Man's voice stopped him. "Don't think too long?" Jake nodded and stepped back into the reception, but now he had critical intelligence. 45 minutes until deadline. Voluntary compliance required. Pressure tactics only. That meant they couldn't afford to hurt anyone before 7:30 p.m. Jake stepped back into the reception area at 5:38 p.m., with 112 minutes remaining until deadline and a growing understanding of the situation. These weren't random terrorists. They were professionals executing precision operation designed to send a political message. But Gray Suit Man had revealed crucial intelligence without realizing it. They needed Judge Patterson to voluntarily withdraw his nomination, which meant they couldn't risk harming him or his family before the deadline. That restraint was Jake's tactical advantage. He moved through the cocktail crowd, camera raised, photographing guests while conducting reconnaissance. Now that he knew what to look for, he spotted at least 4 more operatives positioned strategically throughout the reception. Professional coverage, overlapping fields of fire, coordinated positions. Judge Patterson stood near the bar, completely unaware of the threat, discussing Supreme Court precedents with his son and new daughter-in-law. A man who'd spent 30 years making difficult legal decisions, now facing the most important choice of his career without even knowing it. Jake had to warn him, but direct contact would trigger immediate retaliation. He needed another approach. At 5:45 p.m., Jake noticed something that changed everything. The bride's 4-year-old niece had spilled juice on her dress and was being escorted to the restroom by her mother. The path took them directly past one of the operatives Jake had identified. The man made no threatening moves, but his positioning wasn't coincidental. Gray Suit Man's team had weaponized the presence of children to ensure compliance. That's when Jake realized the full scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just political intimidation. It was carefully orchestrated demonstration that federal judges' families were vulnerable targets. Other judges would hear about this incident and factor it into their own decision-making. But here's what made Jake's blood boil. What transformed a professional photographer back into Staff Sergeant Sullivan. These bastards had turned a wedding into a weapon. They'd taken the happiest day of 2 young people's lives and made it a threat against their family. That was unacceptable. Jake raised his camera and photographed the children's table, but he wasn't capturing memories anymore. He was documenting evidence of domestic terrorism. Every parent watching this understands the fear. Your child's safety threatened by people who see innocent lives as leverage. That's what drives ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Staff Sergeant Jake Sullivan hadn't survived 8 years of combat by accepting impossible situations. He'd survived by finding opportunities that enemies didn't anticipate. As he moved through the reception, photographing guests while conducting surveillance, Jake began formulating a plan. Not a dramatic, heroic assault, but something subtler, something that used the terrorists' own operational requirements against them. They needed Judge Patterson to make a voluntary public statement. That meant they couldn't simply kill him and claim credit. The political message required the judge to appear to withdraw under normal circumstances. Jake spotted his opportunity when he noticed the club's emergency fire alarm system. Fire codes required immediate evacuation when alarms activated. But unlike a bomb threat or security alert, fire alarms didn't suggest terrorism. They suggested mechanical failure. If Jake could trigger the fire suppression system without being detected, the resulting evacuation would scatter the terrorists' carefully planned operation while getting civilians to safety. But here's what Jake hadn't anticipated. What would change everything in the next 30 minutes? Gray Suit Man's team had contingency plans for evacuation scenarios, and one of those contingencies involved turning a wedding evacuation into something much deadlier. He photographed his way toward the club's utility corridor, noting that kitchen staff were too focused on dinner preparation to monitor every corner of the building. At 6:15 p.m., exactly 75 minutes before deadline, Jake's phone buzzed with a message that made his hands shake. Phase 3 authorized. Escalation protocols now active. Time remaining, 75 minutes and counting. At 6:15 p.m., Jake Sullivan stood in the utility corridor with 75 minutes until deadline and a message on his phone that changed everything. Phase 3 authorized. Escalation protocols now active. He'd been trying to find a way to trigger the fire alarm system when his blood ran cold. Through the corridor window, he could see Gray Suit Man talking rapidly into a radio while his team moved to new positions around the reception area. Something had changed. The operation was accelerating. Jake's military instincts screamed danger as he watched the operatives shift from surveillance mode to what looked like assault preparation. The careful restraint he'd observed earlier was gone. These weren't people planning to wait until 7:30 p.m. anymore. His phone buzzed again. Wedding photographer interfering with operation. Neutralize if necessary. They weren't just monitoring him anymore. They were targeting him. Jake's 8 years of Ranger training kicked into overdrive. Enemy forces, civilian population, limited weapons. No backup. He'd been in worse situations in Afghanistan, but never with 180 innocent wedding guests in the crossfire. He had to move fast. Jake slipped through the service corridor toward the main electrical panel, but what he found there made his heart stop. Someone had already been there. Professional modifications to the building's emergency systems, bypass circuits, override switches. Gray Suit Man's team hadn't just planned to use the venue, they'd prepared it. But here's what they hadn't anticipated. What 8 years of combat engineering had taught Jake Sullivan. Every electrical system has vulnerabilities. Every backup has a backup. And sometimes the best way to win isn't to fight the system, but to break it completely. Jake pulled out his tactical knife and went to work on the main power distribution panel. Not to trigger alarms, but to create total electrical failure. In complete darkness, professional operators lost their biggest advantage: coordinated positioning. At 6:23 p.m., Jake cut through the main power cables. The venue plunged into absolute darkness. Emergency lighting flickered on 30 seconds later, casting eerie shadows through the reception area as 180 wedding guests suddenly found themselves in near total darkness. Confused voices, nervous laughter, the sound of chairs scraping as people tried to navigate. But Jake wasn't relying on emergency lights. He'd memorized the layout, exit positions, and threat locations during his earlier reconnaissance. In the darkness, he had the advantage. He moved through the panicked crowd like a ghost, using his camera's flash to navigate while staying invisible to the operatives who were now shouting into radios and trying to re-establish control. "Ladies and gentlemen, "Please remain calm," came a voice over the battery-powered PA system. "We're experiencing a temporary power outage. Staff will escort you to the emergency exits." But Jake knew better. Those staff members were Gray Suit Man's team, and they weren't planning evacuations. They were herding civilians into kill zones. He had to find Judge Patterson before they did. Jake spotted the judge near what had been the bar, trying to calm other guests, while his son Michael kept asking what was happening. In the dim emergency lighting, Judge Patterson looked exactly like what he was. A federal judge attending his son's wedding, completely unprepared for a terrorist attack. "Judge Patterson," Jake whispered, approaching from behind. "Don't turn around. Don't react. I'm the wedding photographer, and you're in immediate danger." "What are you talking about?" the judge whispered back, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "There's a team of operatives here to force you to withdraw your nomination. They've been planning this for weeks. We need to get you out now." But as Jake spoke, he spotted movement in the emergency lighting. 3 figures in staff uniforms moving toward their position with military precision. "This way," Jake whispered urgently. "Stay low." "Follow my voice." He led Judge Patterson and Michael through the crowd toward the emergency exit near the pro shop, but Gray Suit Man's voice echoed through the darkness. "Building is now locked down. Nobody leaves until we resolve this situation." Jake heard the mechanical sounds of doors being sealed, electronic locks engaging, emergency exits being secured from the outside. They were trapped. But Staff Sergeant Sullivan had been trapped before. In Kandahar, when Taliban forces surrounded his patrol. In Fallujah, when IEDs blocked every escape route. Being trapped just meant you had to fight your way out. "Judge, can you use a weapon?" Jake whispered. "I was in the Navy 30 years ago," Patterson replied. "I remember the basics." Jake reached into his camera bag and pulled out the tactical knife he'd carried since Afghanistan. Not much against professional operators, but better than nothing. "Michael, take your father and move toward the kitchen. There's a service exit that might not be locked. If you see anyone in catering uniforms who isn't running scared, assume they're hostile." "What about you?" Michael asked. "I'm going to create a distraction." Here's what Jake understood that Gray Suit Man's team didn't. They'd planned for a controlled operation with predictable variables. They hadn't planned for a former Army Ranger with nothing left to lose and 180 innocent people to protect. Jake moved through the darkened reception area like a predator hunting other predators. His military training had taught him that in close-quarters combat, audacity often trumped firepower. If you couldn't outgun the enemy, you could outthink them. He found his first target near what had been the head table, one of Gray Suit Man's operatives trying to set up some kind of equipment in the darkness. Jake approached from behind, silent as death itself. The operative never heard him coming. One swift movement with the tactical knife, and the first threat was neutralized. Jake relieved him of a radio and a sidearm. Now he had communications intelligence and firepower. The radio crackled. "Alpha 1 down." "Repeat. Alpha 1 is down." "Unknown, hostile in the building." Gray Suit Man's voice responded. "All units converge on the main reception area. Find that photographer." But Jake was already moving, using the chaos and darkness to his advantage. He'd gone from hunted to hunter in the space of 5 minutes. At 6:35 p.m., Jake heard gunfire. Not aimed shots, but warning shots fired into the ceiling to establish control. Gray Suit Man's team was getting desperate, which made them dangerous. Desperate operators made mistakes, but they also escalated violence. Jake's radio crackled. "Attention wedding guests. We have control of this building. Judge Robert Patterson has 5 minutes to contact his Senate liaison and withdraw his nomination, or we begin executing hostages. This was it. The moment Jake had been dreading. They'd moved from intimidation to direct threats against innocent lives. But here's what Gray Suit Man hadn't counted on. What made his professional operation vulnerable to an improvised response? Jake Sullivan wasn't just a wedding photographer trying to protect people. He was a combat veteran who'd spent 8 years learning how to neutralize people who threatened innocence. And he was very, very good at it. Jake keyed the radio he'd taken from the first operative. "This is Ranger 5-7 to hostile team leader. You have 10 seconds to surrender before I start hunting you systematically." Silence on the radio for a moment. Then Gray Suit Man's voice. "Who is this?" "Staff Sergeant Jake Sullivan, 75th Ranger Regiment. 8 years of combat operations. You picked the wrong wedding to terrorize." Another pause. Then, "Mr. Sullivan, you're outnumbered 4-1. Surrender now, and the civilians won't be harmed." Jake smiled in the darkness. "I've been outnumbered before. Last time was in Afghanistan against Taliban forces who actually knew how to fight. You're just terrorists in catering uniforms." He clicked off the radio and went back to work. Over the next 20 minutes, Jake systematically dismantled Gray Suit Man's operation using every dirty trick he'd learned in 8 years of Ranger operations. Improvised explosives from kitchen equipment, ambush tactics using the building's layout, psychological warfare through radio communications. Anyone who's ever felt helpless watching the news, wondering what they'd do if evil came to their doorstep, this is your answer. Sometimes ordinary people find extraordinary strength when innocent lives depend on it. By 6:55 p.m., Gray Suit Man was down to 2 operatives and growing increasingly desperate. The radio chatter had devolved from professional coordination to panicked status reports. "Base, this is Team Leader. Operation is compromised. Request immediate extraction." "Negative, Team Leader. Mission parameters unchanged. You have 35 minutes to complete objectives." Jake realized Gray Suit Man's team wasn't just following orders. They were expendable. Their handlers expected them to succeed or die trying, which meant they had nothing left to lose. That made them extremely dangerous. At 7:10 p.m., exactly 20 minutes before the original deadline, Jake heard Judge Patterson's voice over the PA system. "This is Federal Judge Robert Patterson. I'm withdrawing my nomination for the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, effective immediately." Jake's heart sank. The terrorists had won. But then Judge Patterson continued speaking. "I'm making this statement under duress as the result of domestic terrorism threats against my family and innocent civilians. To the FBI agents who will investigate this incident, the perpetrators are inside this building, and they should be considered armed and extremely dangerous." Gray Suit Man's voice exploded over the radio. "He was supposed to make a clean withdrawal." This burns the entire operation. That's when Jake realized Judge Patterson had just turned Gray Suit Man's victory into defeat. By publicly acknowledging the coercion, he'd transformed a successful intimidation operation into evidence of domestic terrorism. The political message was destroyed. Gray Suit Man's team had failed their mission even while achieving their objective. At 7:15 p.m., Jake heard sirens in the distance. FBI tactical teams, attracted by the judge's public statement. Gray Suit Man's handlers had abandoned the operation, leaving the team to extract themselves. But Jake Sullivan wasn't planning to let them leave. He cornered Gray Suit Man in the kitchen, where the operation had started. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows as the two men faced each other. Professional operator versus combat veteran. "It's over," Jake said, sidearm trained on Gray Suit Man. "Your team is down, your mission failed, and federal agents are surrounding the building." Gray Suit Man smiled coldly. "You think this ends here?" Judge Patterson withdrew his nomination. Other judges heard that message. The operation succeeded. "No," Jake replied. "Judge Patterson explicitly stated he was being coerced. That makes you domestic terrorists, not political activists. Every judge in the country will now see withdrawal as capitulation to terrorism. You just guaranteed that every nomination goes through." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Gray Suit Man's face. "You turned intimidation into inspiration," Jake continued. "You made federal judges into martyrs for judicial independence. This was the biggest tactical failure I've ever seen." Gray Suit Man lunged for a hidden weapon, but 8 years of Ranger training had prepared Jake for that moment. The fight lasted exactly 15 seconds. At 7:30 p.m., as FBI tactical teams breached the building, Jake Sullivan sat in the reception area surrounded by 180 shaken but unharmed wedding guests. Judge Patterson was comforting his son and new daughter-in-law. The bride's dress was torn, the reception was ruined, but everyone was alive. Emma Richardson found Jake sitting alone, still holding his camera. "Are you okay?" she asked. Jake looked up at the young bride whose perfect day had been destroyed by terrorism and who was now worried about his well-being. "I'm fine," he said. "I'm sorry about your wedding." Emma smiled through her tears. "Are you kidding? We'll be telling this story for the rest of our lives. Besides," she added, gesturing toward her new husband helping elderly guests to safety, "I learned something important about the man I married today." Jake watched Michael Patterson helping others despite his own trauma, just like his father had maintained dignity under terrorist threats. "Yeah," Jake said, raising his camera to capture that moment. "I learned something important, too." 3 hours later, Jake Sullivan sat in an FBI debriefing room, giving testimony about domestic terrorism, federal judge intimidation, and the difference between wedding photography and combat operations. 6 months later, Judge Robert Patterson was confirmed to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals by a unanimous Senate vote. And Jake Sullivan's photography business had a 6-month waiting list, because apparently there's high demand for wedding photographers who can handle anything. As Jake often told clients during consultations, "I specialize in capturing joy instead of threats. But if threats show up anyway, I'm prepared for that too. Because some stories end with happily ever after, and some stories end with justice served. But the best stories, the ones worth telling, end with both."